This happened to my cousin Ken. When he told me about it, his tone was unusually serious, and he made me promise not to tell anyone else. Even after so many years, he says that every New Year's Eve, the memory still fills him with fear. That year, Ken had just dropped out of school and started working with his dad, driving a truck to transport goods. They were hauling coal, and night driving was a normal part of the job. On New Year's Eve, they accepted a short delivery because holiday jobs paid more. They had to deliver a truckload of coal from the town to a county a few miles away. It had been snowing heavily for days. Although the trip wasn't far, the snow caused delays, and they only set off around 2 a.m. when the weather started to clear. The mountain road was flanked by dense forests, and the thick snow made driving slow. The cold cut through like a knife. Around 3 a.m., their truck suddenly broke down. When they stopped to check, they realized the problem was serious and couldn't be fixed quickly. Ken's dad decided to stay and try to repair the truck while sending Ken to wait for the next truck in their convoy to borrow tools. Ken stood by the roadside, lighting a cigarette to keep warm. The forest around him was pitch black, the kind of darkness that felt endless. His fingers were stiff and red from the biting cold, and he stomped his feet to try to stay warm. Suddenly, he noticed a faint light flickering deep in the forest. At first, he thought it might be a distant village, but as he stared, the light seemed strange, like a spotlight on a stage. He could just make out faint figures moving near the light and even hear a soft, distant singing. The sight puzzled him. Who would set up a stage in a freezing forest on a snowy night? His curiosity got the better of him, and he couldn't resist moving closer to take a look. As he approached, the singing grew clearer. He saw a small, makeshift stage built from old wood. It was decorated with red lanterns and faded fabric curtains, like something out of a rural theater troupe. On the stage stood a woman dressed in ancient Chinese opera clothing. Her voice was cold and haunting, with a strange melody unlike anything Ken had ever heard. In front of the stage sat a crowd of spectators, all with their heads bowed. Their faces were hidden and no one seemed to notice Ken standing there. He froze in place, cigarette forgotten in his hand. The whole scene felt strange and unsettling. Ken didn't usually enjoy opera, but something about the woman's voice pulled him in. He found himself taking a few steps closer, unable to look away. Then, without warning, the singing stopped. Every lantern on the stage went dark at the same time. Behind the curtains, flames erupted and quickly spread to the stage. Strangely, the woman remained still, and the audience didn't react at all. Ken panicked and shouted, "Fire!" But the spectators stayed seated, their heads still bowed as if they couldn't hear him. That's when he noticed something odd about them. Their bodies were unnaturally stiff, like stone statues. Some even had a thin layer of snow on their shoulders, as if they had been sitting there for a long time. The fire grew larger and the woman's clothing caught alight, but she stood there unmoving. Her voice resumed, louder, sharper, piercing his ears until he couldn't bear it. Overwhelmed, he turned and tried to run. Just as he turned, he heard a faint sound behind him. He glanced back and froze in terror. The audience, who had been sitting with their heads bowed, were now all staring at him. Their faces were pale and sunken, like lifeless corpses, with hollow, pupilless eyes fixed on him. Ken's legs gave out, and he slipped on the icy ground. He tried to get up, but his arms and legs felt like jelly. The firelight illuminated the scene. On stage, the woman's face was blackened and charred, but her mouth was still moving, letting out a shrill, terrifying laugh. Just when Ken thought it was all over, his phone suddenly rang. The sound was jarring, cutting through the horror like a lifeline. Trembling, he fumbled for his phone and saw it was his dad calling. On the other end, his dad's anxious voice shouted, "Where are you? Come back! The convoy is here!" Ken ended the call, forcing himself to his feet, and ran blindly into the forest. He didn't know how long he ran, but eventually he saw the headlights of the truck through the trees. His dad and the other drivers were waiting for him. When they saw him pale and drenched in sweat, they thought he had slipped and fallen on the road. After that night, Ken never dared to pass through that forest alone again. Locals told him that many years ago, a traveling opera troupe had set up a stage there. On New Year's Eve, a fire broke out, killing everyone in the troupe. Since then, people claim to see the stage appear deep in the forest every New Year's Eve. Ken swore it wasn't just his imagination. The sights, the sounds, and especially the haunting faces of those people were seared into his memory. He said he would never forget them, not even in death.